True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
On a weekday afternoon in 1985, 15-year-old Paula Cooper stabbed 78-year-old Ruth Pelke to death. In a city with a deep-seated history of racism, Ruth was a white, beloved Bible teacher who refused to move out of her overwhelmingly black neighborhood. When Paula and her friends showed up at Ruth's door that day asking about Bible studies, Ruth had happily invited them in. Paula and her friends were black, but Ruth was a person who did not judge people by race. She really loved all people. It was at the core of her beliefs. Join us at the quiet end for Death Sentence, the murder of Ruth Pelke, and the punishment of Paula Cooper. When Paula was sentenced to death, few argued against the state's impending execution of a 10th grader. But when the victim's grandson forgave the girl, the media brought the story to the forefront, and millions signed petitions in support of Paula. So this case raises questions about the value of a human life and whether our justice system is made for rehabilitation or just retribution. And with me is my beer expert with a beer for us to drink.
Yes, I chose one called Why Buy the Cow from Forefathers Brewing. It's a milk stout, about 6% alcohol by volume. So it's a nice little beer to drink. It's a very dark brown, almost black color, big, huge brown head. Went away pretty quickly. Nice aroma, coffee, chocolate, and vanilla. Same thing with the taste. Espresso, dark chocolate, little vanilla, a little bit on the sweet side. Medium body beer. Nice one.
All right. Well, at first I was a little offended by the Why Buy the Cow title because it's part of kind of a sexist comment from history, right?
Yes.
Telling women, don't sleep with that guy because why would he buy the cow if he can get the milk for free?
Exactly.
Pretty insulting, but I decided to let it go because it looks like a yummy beer, and I'm not going to look at it that way.
Oh, sure.
Okay. Sounds good. So why don't we open it up?
Oh, head to the bar.
Okay, Dickie, follow me down here to the quiet end. Beer smells pretty delicious, I have to admit. Now, this case was recommended to us by Jane, and before we get started, I'm going to give a trigger warning for suicide, because there is a suicide in this story. And a reminder to our premium subscribers, if you subscribed with PayPal, please go back to the website and re-enter your payment information. We did have a recent update, and your information may have been purged from the site, which would mean you'd stop getting your ad-free and bonus content. There's a link in the show notes for you, and we appreciate you. Sorry about that. Let's get started, Dickie, with this case.
Okay. It's a tough case to
Well, they
talk
all
about.
are.
This one just struck me.
It's very sad from all angles.
So we're going to talk about Gary, Indiana in 1985 and start out by telling you about a girl named Paula Cooper and the woman who had become her victim, Ruth Pelke. Paula and her older sister, Rhonda, lived in a house just around the corner from Bethune Elementary School. Of these two sisters that lived in their small yellow house, Paula was the gentler girl, the baby. Rhonda was tougher, and she was the boss. And when they were young, Paula would often get into fights after school because she's, kind of the gentle, easy one. But she sometimes would start something she couldn't finish, and she'd run back home with usually some angry girls running after her. Paula would run right towards her big sister, and Rhonda was left to do the fighting. And she was a joker about this. And Paula would often watch the fight and laugh about what she had accomplished.
Yeah, but above all, Paula liked to dance. Whenever it was just her and Rhonda at home, the two of them played music. Rhonda got a Jackson 5 record from the back of a cereal box, and they played it over and over. Now, this really is funny because that brought me back to when I was in kindergarten. And they would have these little 45 records on the cereal boxes sometimes.
Yeah.
And, if that's all you had, that's what you'd play. So Paula tried to teach her sister new moves, but Rhonda just wasn't as coordinated. The two girls liked their neighborhood. There were a lot of kids around to ride bikes or play outdoors. But these sisters were often kept apart from the other kids. No one was allowed to come over to their house, and they were not allowed to visit other kids' homes.
These are house rules, huh?
Apparently. They could only sit inside, and they accommodated their difficult home life by sometimes making up games that could be played with friends from their doorway.
I can picture that. So they'd be inside the house, friends outside on the porch or on the sidewalk, and they'd play, interact with each other.
Yeah. So most days and nights, Rhonda was expected to babysit Paula, while their mom Gloria worked long hours as a lab technician. Most of the time, their father wasn't around. So Rhonda would get Paula up and dressed for school, make their breakfast, help with homework, and cook dinner. From a very young age, Rhonda played the role of mother to Paula. Still, sometimes they stopped acting like mother-daughter and they were kids together, dancing like I mentioned, or fixing each other's hair, watching TV, eating sweets. So it was a good relationship. The girls were both born in Chicago, where their mother and her family were from. And that's where their mother, Gloria, met Ron Williams. That's the guy she started dating right after high school. After about 1 year together, Gloria became pregnant, and then the two were engaged to be married. So the plan was to have a wedding quickly. But as they began to make the arrangements, they began to argue a lot. And their arguments didn't really make any sense to Ron. He started to worry that Gloria might be mentally unstable. So he decided to postpone things. Then they began a vicious circle of breaking up and getting back together. And by the time Gloria gave birth to Rhonda, she just seemed so erratic and volatile that Ron wanted to sue her and get full custody of Rhonda. But when Ron told his mother about this plan, she argued with him and said, no, you can't take a child away from her mother. So he let it go, at least for then. Then within a few months, Gloria did get married to a man named Herman Cooper, and she convinced him to raise Rhonda as his own. So when Ron wanted to visit with Rhonda, they told her that he was her uncle. Soon Gloria and Herman had Paula, and when the girls were 8 and 5 years old, the family moved to Gary. There they rented a small 3-bedroom house in Marshalltown, and Herman did odd jobs and Gloria worked at the hospital. But over time, Herman became more and more abusive, hitting and beating them, and that was just considered acceptable punishment for even the smallest infractions. Their small yellow house was located across from a small storefront church, New Testament Baptist, and after they were settled into the neighborhood, Gloria sent the girls there for Sunday school. Neither Gloria nor Herman went to the church with them, though. Rhonda and Paula didn't really mind. They didn't know any better, and it got them out of the house. So they followed the rules. On the day of the girls' baptism, Gloria didn't even attend. So one of the mothers from the church stood in for her. Herman would just disappear for weeks at a time, coming and going whenever he felt like it. When he was home, he repeatedly beat the girls with electrical cords, belts, and his fists. And he would actually call them into their bedroom and order them to come out with all of their clothes off, because that way, he said, they'd really feel it when he punished them. So this guy turned out to be a monster.
Total monster. But their mother didn't help. She was heading down that track too. To deal with all of this, Gloria emotionally retreated, leaving the girls to fend for themselves. And her drinking got to be quite bad. She would drink herself to unconsciousness most every night. She often locked Herman out of the house, but he would figure out how to break in. So late at night, Paula and Rhonda would listen to them fighting. Gloria and Herman had made a habit of separating, then getting back together, just over and over and over. And their fights, which were frequent, were often quite violent.
Yeah, so in 1979, during one of their breakups, Gloria led the girls into the garage, put them into her car, and ran the engine. Rhonda was 12 at this time and Paula was 9. In the back seat of Gloria's red Chevy Vega, the girls were exhausted, and they knew what their mother was intending to do. She had kept them up all night talking and shouting and crying to them about where they'd be going together. So with her daughters inside, Gloria closed the garage door and got into the front seat of her car, rolling down the windows and turning the key in the ignition. She waited for them to close their eyes and fall asleep. So the engine continued running and the air thickened with exhaust. It was early morning by then, so outside of the garage the neighbors began to wake up. And what Rhonda would remember next was that she and Paula were laying side by side on their bottom bunk, not having any idea how they'd gotten there. Rhonda didn't know how much time had passed before she was able to move her body, but when she was able to get up, she saw a letter from Gloria taped to their door, and it said that she was finishing what she had set out to do. So this was horrifying.
It must have been horrible.
Yeah, beyond horrible. I can't even imagine this.
And they're still little kids.
Yes, they are.
So Rhonda called her aunt, and the aunt told her to run and get a neighbor. The neighbor, Mr. Hollis, dragged Gloria out of the garage and put her on her back on the lawn. And another neighbor from across the street, who was a nurse, came over and started CPR on Gloria. The ambulance arrived. They took over care of Gloria and took her to the hospital. Something that Rhonda would never forget was that no one examined the girls. The sisters were sent to stay with their aunt. No one checked their health or their mental states.
So that's pretty crazy.
That's a big omission.
Why weren't these children taken to the hospital? You just have to wonder, besides psychological damage, what did this physically do to them?
Right. But maybe, I guess the only thing that I could think of would be that they didn't know that the girls were in the garage too.
Well, no, they did know. They were well aware.
Then they screwed up.
Yes. Well, you're going to find a lot of screwing up in this story. So Gloria survived, and after a week, she left the hospital against medical advice and picked up her daughters. No one questioned any of it, and no one came for the girls. Rhonda would later say that this was when Paula began to change. After all, they were all supposed to have been dead. Not only had they been expecting to die, but they'd actually been hoping to die. That's how bad their lives were.
It must have been miserable.
Yes, absolutely. But they were still alive, and they were right back in the same abusive situation. So that had to be tough.
The house where Rhonda and Paula lived, as you said, was in Marshalltown, kind of a subdivision of the city, and this had been integrated by black working-class families in the 1950s. Months after the murder/suicide attempt by Gloria, Rhonda learned that Herman was not her biologic father. Her father was her uncle, Ron, a nice man who had visited a few times. Since Herman's abuse had been more focused on her, Rhonda now understood that Herman probably resented her because she was not his child. So at age 13, Rhonda began to run away, not just once. And each time she would be repeatedly picked up by the police and returned to the house. And eventually a judge sent her to a juvenile detention center. She spent months in that institution and then was returned to her mother.
Again, yeah.
Again. And I'm sure, without knowing for a fact, but I'm sure it's true, that she didn't get any therapy at the juvenile detention center.
I would definitely bet not. So the next time Rhonda planned to run away, Paula begged her to take her with her. So one night, in the middle of the night, they left together. And they found an abandoned house, which unfortunately there were quite a few in the area. They went inside and fell asleep. The next day they made it to the home of a friend, who told them that their parents were looking for them. So Rhonda refused to return and filed a report with the police. 2 officers talked to the girls, but you know what they did? Guess.
They took them back home.
Back to Gloria, right. A court did set up family therapy, but the parents refused to participate. The girls attended the sessions alone. Gloria and Herman were never ordered to go with them. So the girls ran away again and were placed in a series of group homes and foster homes. And every placement was temporary. The system was set up on the premise that a child's parents are the best caretakers. That's a nice premise, but in some cases, that's just not the case. It's not true.
No, it isn't.
And in this case, it was not true.
And nobody looked at the numbers of times these kids had run away or anything like that. It's just back to home.
Yeah, apparently. So Rhonda's father, Ron, asked their caseworker how he could adopt both sisters, because he seemed like a decent kind of normal guy. And she told him that the Cooper parents were crazy and that she didn't want any complications to interfere with her own retirement, because this caseworker was due to retire in just 6 months.
Oh, so she's a good advocate.
Yeah, so fuck the kids, fuck all that. I just want to retire and I don't want to have to deal with these people, basically. Yep. Finally, when Rhonda was 14, she was able to move in with Ron, but this was horrible for Paula. Now Paula's alone in the hands of Gloria and Herman. So without her sister, things are just far, far worse. So after Rhonda left, Paula began skipping classes and fighting with girls at school. Now Herman would turn all of his attention to abusing Paula. So she began to run away on her own. And one night after being beaten by her father, Paula ran to the police station and she actually begged them to give her somewhere else to live. At age 13, she was passed from stranger to stranger for 2 years, but between these stays, she was always returned to be miserable with Gloria and Herman.
One morning, after she turned 14, Paula wouldn't get out of bed. She wouldn't talk to anyone. She wouldn't even open her eyes. She seemed to be catatonic. And eventually, Gloria took her to be evaluated. So Paula was put in a mental health center in East Chicago for observation. After 4 days, she was released again and again into the care of her dysfunctional and abusive parents. So this was a good stay at the health center.
I know. And this catatonia makes me think of things I've read about children of war and how some kids do just shut down. They stop eating, talking. They just sleep all the time.
Yeah.
So they just can't deal with it. And that's how I kind of see it with Paula.
You just withdraw.
Yeah, you get to a point. What else can you do to protect yourself? Nothing. So let's fast forward to the spring of 1985. Paula was 15, and she was on her lunch break at Lew Wallace High School. She and her friends, Karen and April, decided to skip their afternoon classes to go to an arcade nearby called Candyland. This was Paula's 4th high school, and she'd only been there for a few weeks. Karen was one of Paula's best friends at school, and she was a large girl with a soft, round face. Everyone called her Pookie. Karen was 16 years old, and she had a 3-year-old child who was mostly cared for by Karen's godmother.
So she was like 12 or 13?
Yes. Yes, she was actually 12 when she was impregnated by a 17-year-old, and nothing was ever done about that. But that's not all. April was 15, and she was already pregnant too, but she was hiding it. The 3 girls walked the few blocks to the arcade where they played some games, talked to some boys, and bought some snacks. And there wasn't much going on, and they were bored. But all of these girls were sexually active, and 2 of them had a baby or were pregnant. April had invited another girl along when they went to the arcade, and this was Denise, and she was only 14. She was the youngest. Together, the girls walked to the house where April lived with some of her siblings, and they planned to hang out on the porch and drink some wine. Earlier that week, the girls had robbed a neighbor. They had broken a window near the back door, climbed in, and they'd come out with about $90. But by now, most of that money had been spent. So the girls were looking up and down the block at the houses when April mentioned an old woman who lived in the house just behind hers. "Remember that lady we saw standing out back?" she asked. And Paula and Karen nodded. They could remember her. "We could go over to her house," April said, "because she has a lot of money and jewelry and different things." The place the girls were talking about was just across the alley. It was a bright white house with columns out front, and this was the home of Ruth Pelke. April said that Ruth was a Bible school teacher, so the way to get into her house would be to ask her for information about a Bible study that Ruth used to lead every week. Ruth was 78 years old. She was a widow who lived alone. Ruth used to volunteer with Child Evangelism Fellowship, driving into downtown Gary once a week to teach children 8 and under in an after-school program. Ruth had also organized local 5-day clubs for the fellowship, usually during the summer, and there Ruth would talk to kids about her faith, and when kids didn't have parents to take them to church, she would bring them along, and she would take them to her church, Glen Park Baptist. So this is actually what she'd done for April a few years back. But April didn't tell Paula, Karen, or Denise about any of the kindnesses that Mrs. Pelke had done for her in the past. And they didn't know how well April knew this lady in the White House. April had been among Mrs. Pelke's last students 2 years ago, shortly before Ruth's husband died, and she had retired from teaching. She had even driven April and her brother to church for their very first time. And after April's mother died, Mrs. Pelke had reached out to her again. She had invited April over for meals, and she'd even packed her lunches for school. So this is how that day, April knew that Mrs. Pelke would likely be alone. April assumed that Mrs. Pelke had money in the house because of the many things she'd done for April and her brother. She thought, well, if a person gives as much as Mrs. Pelke did, then they must have more than they need anyway.
Forgetting all the kindness that this woman had shown her.
Yes.
For a length of time, not just a one-and-done deal.
Yes, and really gone above and beyond. Making school lunches, driving her to church.
Yeah.
Done a lot for her.
And her family, her brother.
Yes.
Since settling in Gary more than 40 years ago, Ruth had taught hundreds of children. In neighborhood living rooms, she'd gathered kids together, seating them cross-legged on the carpet, and served them Kool-Aid and cookies. Back when Ruth first married into the Pelke family, she became part of a group that was strongly Baptist. Pelkes were part of a Baptist community in Gary that revolved entirely around church life. If you weren't at work or at school, you were at church. You showed up for services, for Bible study, for after-work prayer meetings, and you participated in volunteer projects. Glen Park Baptist had been just a few blocks from Ruth and her husband Oscar's house. She taught their early Sunday school class before attending morning service. On Wednesdays, she went to prayer meetings and Pioneer Girls meetings, followed by choir practice. She made quilts for visiting missionaries with the women's circle and hosted the visitors in her home. She knitted booties for the new babies in the congregation. She drove her friends to church, and she tithed any extra money she and Oscar had, even though it was never a lot.
Yeah, Ruth didn't have any biological children. When she married Oscar, he was a father and a widow. Ruth and Oscar eventually would have 9 grandchildren and 15 great-grandchildren, and they all would call her Nana. And holidays were always celebrated at Nana and Granddad's house. But in the 2 years after Oscar's death, holidays were celebrated at other family members' houses. Her house had become quiet, but Ruth still gardened and mowed her lawn with a push mower. She went out for her own groceries, so she really could not imagine moving. Her family sometimes worried about her alone in the neighborhood, but she just would not consider leaving because this was her home. When Paula and the other girls went to Ruth's house, Ruth had her 79th birthday coming up in just a few days. She'd lived in her white house on Adams Street since the early 1940s. Most of the friends she and her husband had already relocated to the suburbs. The families who'd moved in since were poorer. Now when something, even a window broke, many of her neighbors just left it unfixed. Police cars regularly patrolled the area, and Ruth had a sign on her front door that read, "The owner of this property is armed. There is nothing inside worth risking your life for." But in spite of this warning, her home had been robbed 4 times in the past 2 years.
I think it's time to move.
Well, that's what her family thought. One of her stepdaughters suggested that they move in together, and a stepson had offered to help her make some repairs and sell the house. But even after Oscar died, she had no interest in leaving. It was her home. It had a lot of memories. Maybe she thought she could just live out her final years there. Doesn't seem like too much to ask.
No, it doesn't. But if you broke it into 4 times in a 2-year period, that tells you something.
Well, there's some crime going on, yes.
So it's after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, May 14th, 1985, the girls left April's porch to go to the Bible teacher's house. April stayed behind so that Mrs. Pelke wouldn't see her. She was much too familiar. Paula and the others crossed the alley behind the White House on Adams Street. They walked across the lawn, up the front steps. Karen rang the doorbell, and as the 3 girls stood and waited, they could hear the sound of slow steps on the floorboards. Then they saw movement behind the door's glass panel. Mrs. Pelke opened the door. From behind Karen, Paula looked at the woman for the first time. She'd never seen her before.
No, I think April's the only one, although they'd seen her in the yard.
Yeah.
Mrs.
Pelke was an elegant-looking woman. Her hair was set in neat white curls, and she wore eyeglasses that curved upward at either end. I think that was the style most popular in the 60s.
I think so, yeah.
She was only slightly shorter than Paula, but she looked pretty small and fragile.
Yeah. Well, she's 79. She's kind of a tiny woman. So.
Yeah, well, at that age, you start getting smaller.
My auntie would like to know about Bible classes, Karen said to Ruth. When y'all hold them? Well, now's not a good time, Ruth told the girls, but she said if Karen and her aunt came over on Saturday, she'd be happy to give them all of the information. Then Mrs. Pelke closed her door. So the girls turned around and left. If only it had ended there. Every time that I go through this story in my mind, I think, why didn't it just end there?
Yep.
Yeah. So back at April's house, April pulled a knife out of a kitchen drawer and said to Paula, "Hey, you could scare the lady with this." So now we're going down a really bad road.
Yeah, this doesn't sound like things are going to end well.
No. It was a butcher knife, very wide and about 12 inches long. This time, April told the other girls that they should go to the lady's house and tell her that they need all the information about the classes written down, like the dates, the address, and the phone number. So Paula took off her white jean jacket and wrapped the knife inside of it to hide it. Then they crossed the alley again and went around the corner back to Ruth Pelke's house. So once again, Karen rang the doorbell, and Mrs. Pelke came to the door. Paula stood behind the others, holding her jacket close to her chest. Mrs. Pelke opened the screen door and let them inside this time, and they all entered her living room, and Paula put her jacket down on the sofa. Then they followed Mrs. Pelke into the dining room, where there was a large table, an organ, and a writing desk. Above the desks, there was a black and white photo of Oscar as a child standing next to a horse.
So Mrs. Pelke paused at the desk and pulled out a pen and a pad of paper from the drawer. She was going to write a note for the girls with all the information on Bible classes. But when she leaned over, Paula came up from behind her, knocked her down to the floor. So she landed kind of sitting on the carpet with her legs splayed in front of her. Just within reach on the table, there's a glass paperweight. Paula grabbed it, whacked Ruth hard on the head. Her head began to bleed, and the elderly woman was down completely on the floor. So Paula was looking down at her. Now Mrs. Pelke was no longer who she was when she had answered the door, no longer that well-kept churchwoman with the white curls. Paula would later remember what came next. She picked up the knife and began slashing at Ruth. She made cuts on her arms and legs, shouting, "Where's the money, bitch?" She shouted this repeatedly, slashing at her dress and cutting through her skin. Mrs. Pelke is now flat on her back, and Paula climbed on top of her.
So brutal, right?
Terribly brutal.
Be it rage or whatever, Paula was set off, and she continued to attack with the knife. She stabbed Ruth Pelke in her chest, pulling it out and stabbing her again and again. The knife entered her chest more than 30 times before Paula stopped and then left the blade in Ruth's stomach. Paula then looked at Denise, who'd been watching with her back against the wall. And Paula told Denise to hold the knife, but Denise was pretty shooken up. She said she couldn't, but that Karen could do it. But Karen just stood there. "I can't look at the lady," Karen said. So you think maybe Karen's having a conscience. Maybe she's going to do the right thing here, but no. She left the dining room and she returned with a bath towel, and Karen put it over Mrs. Pelke's face before she sat across the legs of this dying woman.
I think the time for doing the right thing had long passed anyway.
Well, I know, but I'm thinking if Paula had killed this woman, maybe this Karen would say, "Oh my God," and leave and get the police or something.
Yeah.
Maybe it was too late to save her. It probably was. But just the fact that she got a towel to cover her face so she wouldn't have to look at her, that's pretty bad. That just makes me really sad. So then Paula went to search the house. In one of the bedrooms, she found a key ring on top of the dresser. So she rushed past Denise, who was going through a closet, and Karen, who was still with Mrs. Pelke on the floor. Paula tried to use the key to start Mrs. Pelke's car, but it didn't work. Just then she saw April crossing the alley. The two entered the house together. Then they joined Denise in tearing through the house looking for valuables. The girls dragged bags and blankets out of the bedroom closet, pulled out dresser drawers and sofa cushions, and then they found the key to the car, and they got $10.
A big haul.
Yeah. During the search, Karen stayed crouched over Mrs. Pelke holding onto the knife, and after 15 minutes had passed, Karen decided to test if the knife blade would go in deeper. So she pushed it into Ruth's body. She pushed it down through Ruth's chest until the tip came out the other side through the carpet and actually went into the wooden floorboard beneath. Then Karen rocked the handle from side to side, so Ruth's pinned like a specimen to her own dining room floor. She was still dying, and the girls were moving through her house, touching and just throwing her things around. So just a really horrible scene. And April knew this woman. So in the early afternoon on the day after Ruth was killed, her stepson Bob stopped by her house for a visit. He and his wife had gone over for dinner just 2 nights ago. But Bob was getting worried because when he'd called Ruth that morning, as he did most days, no one answered. At Ruth's house, Bob stepped onto the front porch and rang the doorbell. No answer. So he bent over and called out through the small mail slot. Still no answer. Peering in through the opening, he saw the dining room, and he saw that the carpet was just covered with stuff. Ruth was a meticulous housekeeper, so this was very alarming. So now, more nervous, Bob walked around the back of the house, and he got the extra key from under a wooden board near the basement entrance. He returned to the porch and he let himself inside. And there in the dining room, he saw Ruth lying on the carpet with a towel over her face. Her arms were stiff and bent at the elbows. The backs of her hands were covered in blood. On the far side of the room, her white stationery was scattered on the floor. Stamps, pens, pencils, and letters that Ruth had saved had all been dumped out of the desk drawers. He touched her, and her body was cold. She'd been dead for a while. Then he saw that the phone was torn out of the wall, so he had to run out into the street to look for help.
But none of the neighbors were answering their doors. So Bob ran up to a car that had just pulled in down the street. A couple stepped out and he asked them to call the police, that his mother had been killed. Gave the couple the address and ran back to wait for the police. Around 10 minutes after, the detectives arrived, followed by the media. That evening, the Pelke family members gathered at Bob's house. About a dozen family members stood around and shared theories. It must have been a robbery, probably drug-related. The next day, Ruth's murder was on the front page of the local newspaper. The killing was covered as a robbery, but when Ruth was left alone on the floor to die, she was still wearing her diamond ring. Certainly, robbers would have at least tried to take the ring.
You would think so. 2 days after the murder, 2 students were arrested at Lew Wallace High School, and then 2 others were taken to the police station. 4 girls in all, ages 14, 15, and 16.
How did they get arrested?
Well, we'll get into that.
Oh, I see.
One of their classmates had reported that the girls had given her a ride in Mrs. Pelke's car, so that was the first connection. Then Paula Cooper had left a white jacket at the murder scene with a birth control prescription in its pocket that was made out to her name, so that was a dead giveaway.
Yeah.
Gloria had just filed a missing person report about her daughter, too, and Paula had spent the night in Ruth Pelke's stolen car. So the Lake County prosecutor, Jack Crawford, visited Bob to discuss what justice would look like to his family, what they would want. Crawford had been elected on a tough-on-crime platform. Indiana was one of 37 death penalty states at the time, and it was a state that allowed for the execution of minors. In fact, the minimum age for the death sentence in Indiana was just 10 years old. Can you imagine?
Wow.
That's a baby.
Sure is.
No matter what they do, how can you think a 10-year-old is just unfixable? That's it.
You can't.
No, that's pretty crazy. But Crawford believed that the girls should face the ultimate punishment, and he wanted the Pelke family's blessing. So he let Ruth's family speak for a while about their anger and their sadness. Then he talked about justice and process, and he told them their options. He finished by asking, "Is there anyone here who is adamantly against my decision to seek the death sentence for the killer?" And they were all okay with going for the death sentence, which kind of surprises me. I don't know. I mean, an elderly member of their family had just been brutally killed, so I can't really blame them if they were okay with it, at least then. But you think someone may have brought up, well, this was a 10th grader? You know, just maybe thought about it a little, I guess.
Maybe. At 15, they could also think she's pretty much an adult.
But she's not.
I know she's not.
Not at all. Nowhere near.
But she's the size of an adult, probably, at age 15.
Yeah.
And they're asking the family members of this poor lady who had been horribly murdered.
Yeah.
I can see where their thoughts would be leaning towards the death penalty.
Yeah, I can understand it. At least at that point, I can. As Lake County prosecutor, Crawford pushed for the death sentence 22 times, and he won 17 times. So this is one of the highest death penalty conviction rates of a county prosecutor in Indiana's history. But he was also sensitive to his standing with his black voters. All 4 girls involved in Ruth Pelke's murder were black. So what he did was he consulted with some of the county's black ministers to determine the mood of their community. But no one Crawford spoke with had any objections to putting a 10th grader to death. The crime was just so violent, and the victim was an elderly, devout Christian woman, a Bible teacher. So people were outraged, and they really wanted death.
Yeah, well, they want retribution.
They do. But how do you feel about that as a pediatrician, about treating a 15-year-old as an adult, no matter how horrible what they did was?
Well, no, I mean, neurologically, mentally, they're not an adult at
Right.
age 15.
And then
Yeah.
I think you also have to consider the way she was raised. That's a big thing.
Well, there's a lot of things it's kind of contingent on, but it's still not a good idea. So yeah, 15-year-old is not an adult and can't think like an adult. So trying to execute a 15-year-old would be against my wishes.
Right. And really against the science, in your opinion.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
At the same time, you can't draw a line, really, and say, okay, 15, 16, 18, 20, 21.
Exactly.
Where are you going to put it?
I know. That makes it tough.
It does.
I mean, I'd have to say, I don't think I was really thinking like an adult till 37, 38.
Yeah.
Honest to God.
Oh,
Yeah. I don't think my brain was totally there.
I'm still not there.
Right. So you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So at 15, it's just really hard to imagine. So in the next several months, Karen, April, and Denise each received a lengthy prison sentence for their role in this home invasion and murder. Paula's sentencing hearing was in July 1986. Reporters from the Indiana papers and other news agencies were there, but you know who wasn't there? Were Paula's parents. Neither of them. They weren't there to support her. They never helped her with any legal issues, getting a lawyer, anything from the very beginning. The deputy prosecutor and Crawford were at the plaintiff's table with members of the Pelke family sitting behind them. And across the aisle sat the public defender and Paula's sister Rhonda and the girl's grandfather Abraham. Paula's parents had actually moved out of the state shortly after Paula was arrested, so thanks, Mom. Thanks, Dad.
And they had nothing to do with her.
No. And in my opinion, they caused a lot of this.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly didn't help her upbringing, did it?
Absolutely not. You could never understand doing that to a person at all, but you kind of can understand someone raised like that as having some rage, some issues.
You certainly would.
So it was 10 a.m. when Paula was led into the courtroom. As she entered, Paula was smiling, as if in response to something the officer beside her had said. Witnesses testified for the prosecution, and that included forensic specialists, corrections officers, girls who had seen Paula driving Mrs. Pelke's stolen car. But the most memorable person who spoke was Bob Pelke, Ruth's stepson, and he made a plea on behalf of the entire family. He said, "Do what has to be done, annihilate the criminals, so that decent people can enjoy the life that God has given them." A lesser sentence for Paula, he said, would be immoral, unbiblical, unproductive, a travesty of justice, and a disregard to the rights of victims. So he's not beating around the bush here.
No, he isn't.
And, you know, it always bothers me when people bring religion or God into the courtroom. Separation of church and state, it's one of our primary beliefs as Americans. It's the basis of our Constitution and our rules and our laws. So that irritates me. So Paula's sister Rhonda did take the stand for Paula, and she was only 19. She dressed in her most conservative clothing, really wanting badly to be of help. When asked to describe the frequent beatings by Paula's father, she said that he did it with extension cords and with all of their clothes off. And when asked how in 1979 their mother had convinced them to end their lives together in the garage, Rhonda said, "She told us that this was the best thing for us and that we don't have anything here to live for." But the prosecution showed no interest in the role that childhood abuse had played in Paula's life. And in his closing argument, the deputy prosecutor stated, "Cold-blooded murderers should be put to death to atone for crimes they have committed. The people of Indiana," he said, "shall not be bullied into believing that retribution is evil." So murder is evil, but he doesn't want the people to think that an eye for an eye or taking the life of a killer is evil.
Yeah.
So that's basically the thought.
That's right.
Now, Paula was given a chance to speak, and if she was prepared for this by her attorney, there certainly was no evidence of that. She was both self-pitying and confrontational, saying that the murder was an act that just happened. She looked at the prosecution and she asked, "Where was all these people at right here when I needed somebody?" Then she gestured to the Pelkes and challenged them. "What's going to happen if they take my life? Is that going to bring your mother back, your sister, your aunt? No, that is not going to bring her back. How would you all feel when I'm in my grave?" So that didn't look good. I understand part of it, but it was not a good look.
No.
Because she just didn't look remorseful. And maybe she wasn't remorseful at that point. Maybe she didn't know what it meant to be remorseful. I don't know.
No, she certainly wasn't remorseful.
No.
Or didn't come across as remorseful.
Yes. Certainly, at least at that point. I think things would change years later.
Oh, they did?
Yeah. So then there was a disturbance in the courtroom. Paula's grandfather yelled, "My grandbaby, my grandbaby," and he was escorted out by the bailiff in tears. He was in tears, not the bailiff. I want to make sure I said that right.
Then when it was time for the judge to give his sentence, the courtroom went silent. The judge did not look Paula in the eye.
Now, you might think by that he was cold, but this was actually a black judge who did not believe in the death penalty personally. So he really had a hard time sentencing her, but it was really what he had to do in that position.
Right. He said, "I'm concerned about your background. I'm concerned that you were born into a household where your father abused you and your mother either participated or allowed it to happen. And those seem to be explanations or some indication of why you may be the type of personality that you are. They are not excuses, however. You committed the act and you must pay the penalty." And with that, he sentenced her to death.
Right. So reporters ran from the room to get that story out. It was big news. And as the guards led Paula out, she didn't speak. So she would be moved to Indianapolis, to the Indiana Women's Prison. People streamed out into the hall where Prosecutor Crawford and the Pelke family members were standing together. And Rhonda, upset, shouted in their direction, "Are you satisfied now?" They didn't respond, of course, but Ruth's stepson Bob told reporters, "As far as I'm concerned, justice has been done."
So Paula was sent to death row at Indiana Women's Prison in Indianapolis. Her case was taken up by attorney Monica Foster, who organized a campaign to appeal the sentence, and this campaign was signed by 2 million people. This was all sent to the Supreme Court. Pope John Paul II made a personal appeal to Governor Robert Orr in September 1987, and the Pope made another appeal to the United Nations, and this was a million signatures on this one.
Yeah, Ruth's grandson, Bill Pelke, really had a hard time coping with the way his grandmother had died. "For a year and a half," he said, "whenever I thought of my grandmother, I always picture how she had died, and it was just terrible." At first, he believed that the death penalty was appropriate for Paula Cooper. But then his thoughts turned to how his Bible-teaching grandmother had lived and what she had stood for in her life. According to Bill, this had begun when he saw Paula Cooper's grandfather crying at her trial. And he decided that his grandmother wouldn't have wanted Paula's grandfather to have to endure the death of his granddaughter. So over time, Bill Pelke became more and more convinced that his grandmother would have had forgiveness, love, and compassion for Paula Cooper and her family. In a book about this case that's titled 70 times 7 by Alex Marr, Bill Pelke is quoted, "My grandmother would have been appalled that the girl was on death row. I was convinced that my grandmother would have had love and compassion for this girl and this girl's family, and convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that my grandmother wanted me to have that same love and compassion. I did not have any, but I was so convinced that that's what she would have wanted that in a short prayer I begged God to please, please, please give me love and compassion for Paula Cooper and her family." So Bill realized then that he had never considered Paula's life before, meaning he had never considered the life of a black teenage girl in Gary. He had never considered the life of a child who had run away from home so many times, was passed from one emergency shelter or foster home to another. Some problems were called black, some were called poor, and some were called unchristian, as if the life conditions of so many families were not connected. So he decided that it was a choice to think that way, and that he would choose to think differently. It's pretty amazing that he was able to do this. I don't know if I would be able to.
I know.
And I don't believe in the death penalty, but I think it's different when it's someone in your family. So one day, Bill sat up in the crane that he operated. He had some paper that he'd pulled from the office printer, and he wrote a letter to the girl who had killed his grandmother, the girl who had stabbed her repeatedly and left her there to die. And in large capital letters, he wrote, "I forgive you."
So this was within 3 months after Paula was sentenced to death. Bill Pelke forgave her for what she had done to his grandmother, and he became one of the strongest advocates for removing Paula Cooper from death row, and his advocacy turned out to be very effective. During her incarceration, Pelke visited Cooper in prison, and the two eventually began exchanging weekly emails. He never asked her to explain why she had committed the horrific murder, because, as he said, there's not a good answer for that. Still, he did become convinced that she was truly remorseful for what she had done.
Yeah, so Paula Cooper's case was profiled on 60 Minutes and other TV programs. She was front page news in her hometown of Gary. There was a scandal where it was found that several prison guards had sex with her in her cell. So there's more abuse. In 1987, the Indiana legislature passed a bill raising the minimum age for a defendant in a death penalty case from 10 years old to 16 years old. Although the change was definitely a reaction to Paula Cooper's case, the legislature made it clear that this change would not affect her death sentence. In 1988, a Supreme Court decision, Thompson v. Oklahoma, barred the death penalty for defendants under the age of 16 at the time of the crime. The Indiana Supreme Court considered both of these developments and heard arguments. Her sentence was changed to 60 years in prison on July 3, 1989, and then she was able to earn credits toward early release. So basically, any good day in prison where she didn't get in any trouble was a day off her sentence.
Right. Now, a New York Times editorial called the court's decision brave and said that the law on which her death sentence was based was medieval, as it allowed the execution of children as young as 10 years of age.
Yeah, Paula made some efforts in prison to turn around her life, but she also had some run-ins with the guards there. Her behavior did seem to improve with time after a real low point in 1995, when she was sentenced to 3 years of solitary confinement for assaulting a prison guard. I'm not saying it's okay to assault anyone, but 3 years of solitary confinement?
Yeah.
That sounds pretty severe. That can make you insane.
It sure could.
Department of Correction records show that she was cited 23 times for rules violations, and that included 10 low-level violations. Unruly conduct, being in an unauthorized area, and sexual contact since 2005. But she earned her GED, then a vocational degree, and in 2001 a bachelor's degree. She also helped to train dogs as companions for the disabled, and she worked as a tutor. Then in July of 2013, at the age of 43, she was set free on parole after having served 27 years. And then Paula was placed in Spain's House, which is a halfway home for women in recovery from alcohol and drug addiction. Paula wasn't in recovery herself, but they were willing to give her housing at a very short notice, and that's why she ended up there. Her parole officer, Denise Jackson, introduced Paula to other women as Renee, which was her middle name, and helped her to settle in. Miss Jackson was woken up at 2 a.m. that first night by a phone call from Paula, and she was yelling about how dark the place was. Paula had not slept with the lights out since she was 15 years old, so Miss Jackson promised to buy her a nightlight the next day.
Paula's parole officer wanted to make sure that Paula had constant supervision, so she put together a team to keep Paula company. This team included the house manager at Spain's, a job counselor, a safety officer, a psychologist, and a volunteer from Catholic Charities. So at last, we got something that looks like it's going to be help for Paula.
Yes, but you have to think all those years how much damage was really done.
Oh, I know.
Yeah. I'm not sure how much therapy she got in prison either. But she did seem to have a turnaround. Sometimes Paula stopped by Archbishop Tobin's office to talk about her new life. And for the first 2 weeks, Miss Jackson visited with Paula each day and took her for walks around the neighborhood and sat on the front porch with her to just do some people watching. She introduced Paula to a woman named Kim Kidd, who ran a prison ministry. And Kim helped Paula to open her first bank account, buy her first cell phone, and go shopping at the big Walmart. At the register, when asked to swipe her debit card, Paula would sometimes freeze up and Kim would have to do it for her. Then when she eventually started shopping on her own, Paula would become frustrated and would sometimes run out of the supermarket before she was done shopping. So in some ways, she seemed to Kim and Miss Jackson like she was still a young teenager, at times desperate for help, and then at other times she was really pushing back. It had never been an option in prison to be seen as vulnerable or too dependent on the generosity of others. So this was just a huge transition.
Sure was.
And a lot of people don't survive it.
No, 27 years in prison. Some of that in solitary confinement.
Yeah, and it's not like she went in when she was 30 or 40. She went in when she was just a child.
That's right. Paula's father, Herman Cooper, had died in 2010, and he actually left Paula a small inheritance. But to meet the conditions of her parole, Paula needed to find work. She was hired as a fry cook at a Five Guys fast food restaurant. Never missed a shift. Soon she was promoted to cashier and then shift manager. For a while, handling money and customers during the busiest hours, put a lot of pressure on Paula, but the restaurant chain had a mission of giving work to people who'd spent time in prison, so the management at the Five Guys was very patient with her.
Yeah. Well, the first time her sister Rhonda came to visit Paula at Spain's, they sat down alone together and just said nothing for about 30 minutes. Then Paula said, "Is this really weird?" It hadn't been just the two of them in years. Paula called her sister about 20 times a day, and Rhonda really didn't mind that she needed to rely on her. But what she didn't agree with was Paula's desire to reunite the family, meaning the two of them and their mother. Rhonda seemed to understand who their mother was, but Paula hadn't lost hope. So Rhonda watched as her younger sister reached out to Gloria over and over, and Rhonda just waited for the Gloria she knew to be revealed. Rhonda could feel how afraid Paula was of being alone. Paula drove around with a collection of teddy bears buckled into the back seat of her car, and she called them her babies. She wouldn't move them aside for anything, not even to put grocery bags or passengers back there. But then in other ways, Paula wanted her space. She began pushing back against the rules at Spain's, criticizing the substance abuse training and the curfews. She wanted to live on her own terms, and she wanted her own apartment. So after about 5 months on the outside, she moved into a one-bedroom apartment that Catholic Charities helped her to find. So after work, she sometimes just liked to sit in the living room and look out the window. But Rhonda was becoming concerned about her sister. Paula kept her kitchen cabinets packed with canned food and snacks, hoarding them as if she might never have a chance to buy food again. Rhonda worried that part of Paula was still in prison and always would be. She was working at getting her driver's license, but at age 44, the last time Paula had driven a car was almost 30 years earlier, and that had just been that so-called joyride that she took in Ruth Pelke's Plymouth. So Paula failed her first driving test for going 60 miles an hour in a school zone, but she finally did pass it the next spring. Still, she was by all accounts a terrible driver. She often got lost, and she had a terrifying habit of just hitting the brakes after she'd pull and merge into traffic. In June, Paula finished 1 year of parole, and there would be no more required check-ins with Miss Jackson, also no more monitoring of her everyday decisions. She was free to live by her own choices, but this was very scary for her.
Near the end of the summer, Paula celebrated her second birthday outside of prison. She and Rhonda dressed up and went to Majestic Star Casino in Gary. Paula could not get over the lights and the machines and the oversized buffet. Paula was playing the slot machines. She looked as if she'd never had such a good time in all her life.
Then that fall, at a Kentucky Fried Chicken, a man who worked as a landscaper stopped Paula in the parking lot and convinced her to take his business card. His name was LaShawn. She called him that night and they talked for a while. Then they ended up meeting. At his apartment, she told him about her many years of incarceration, and she stayed over. And then he became more and more curious about her. He looked up her case online, but then he let her take her time sharing her past with him, and her story really opened him up to her. They moved in together quickly, and he took her with him on jobs and taught her to plant flower beds. She liked to just sit outside with him and listen to the birds. LaShawn, who she called Daddy, was twice divorced with 6 kids and 10 grandchildren, and he introduced her to them as Miss Paula. LaShawn had inherited some farmland in Glasgow, Kentucky, and they went there to visit. About 3 months after meeting, on a Thanksgiving visit with Gloria, he proposed to her and she accepted.
Even though they were engaged, LaShawn still wanted to take their time getting married. Paula sometimes had bursts of intense anger, lashing out at him for what he thought was nothing.
Well, you look at Paula's history, which is horrific. But then another thing we haven't even considered is genetically. From her mother, what did she inherit? Because it seems that Gloria had some mental illnesses that were just untreated, or that she was trying to treat with alcohol. So aside from her upbringing, Paula may have had other issues that no one ever bothered to diagnose.
Oh, the whole story. It would be difficult for a person to recover.
Oh, absolutely.
So at those moments when Paula was having one of her anger episodes, LaShawn did his best to remain steady for her. Paula started a new job where she began working in the office of the Indiana Federal Community Defenders, now run by Monica Foster. Monica had handled about 20 capital cases since her time with Paula, and she'd had countless clients who had been raised in terrible situations. Despite the years of living with anxiety and insomnia, she'd been able to continue on with the work because she had developed a strategy of only dealing with what was right in front of her at the time.
Well, and that's what you have to do in those kind of heavy stress situations. I'm totally on board with that.
Yeah, you can't fix everything all at once.
No. So it was after about 20 years of not being in contact when Paula left Monica a message saying, "Hey girl, this is a blast from the past." And Monica knew right away who it was. The two women then went out to dinner, and they sat outside on the deck, eating and drinking wine and gossiping and laughing, and even doing impressions of people they used to know. They had both changed a lot, but there was a feeling of comfort between them, so they began talking regularly and meeting up every other week. Paula had been a lay advocate while at Rockville, and her new job was built on that. She answered phones and helped lawyers correspond with clients who were in jail. She worked on her typing and her legal terminology, and she took some more courses. Paula really loved the chance to dress like a professional and go into an office. Even though she'd been incarcerated herself, she was very pleasant and professional when contacting prison officials. She also had a way of relating to their clients that the attorneys didn't. So within a couple of months, Paula was working there full time. So you think she would have felt quite successful, but there's just a lot still inside of her that's in pain.
I think there's still a lot of demons in there.
Yeah.
On the Sunday of Memorial Day weekend, 2015, Paula visited her friend Mashia at work. They knew each other from Rockville, and she broke down sobbing. Paula had argued with LaShawn, but to Mashia it seemed bigger than that. Paula seemed to her to be like a child who's just totally drained. Paula had said, "Friend, I can't take it anymore. It's the pain inside," pointing to her chest. "I just want it to be over."
So Mashia had insisted that Paula stay the night at her house. And the next day they had a Memorial Day barbecue and they invited Rhonda. Paula held her sister tight that Monday, and Rhonda asked her if anything was wrong. "Everything's fine," Paula said. "Everything's beautiful." Then that night, at Paula's insistence, she and Mashia drove to Walmart, and Paula bought a new outfit. In the middle of the night, when everyone was asleep, she wrote letters to Mashia, LaShawn, and Rhonda, and she placed them on the kitchen stove. So on Tuesday, May 26, 2015, Paula left her friend Mashia's house quietly before sunrise, and she was dressed in new clothes and a pair of sandals. She got into her black Toyota Corolla with her stuffed animals strapped into the back seat. She drove for who knows how long before she pulled into a parking lot and shut off the engine. And it was still dark out. Paula really was not far from LaShawn's apartment. He'd actually taken her for rides in this lot on the back of his motorcycle. Sitting in her car, Paula made recordings saying goodbye again to the people she loved. In a few words, she expressed the kinds of things you would expect. Love and gratitude to Mashia, to Rhonda, and to LaShawn. She apologized to LaShawn for hurting him, and to Monica for leaving this way. But to Gloria, she was more plain-spoken. Her fantasy about a relationship with her mother was finally broken. "You didn't care about me," she said. "You cut me off. You judged me." Nevertheless, Paula said, she still loved her. To all of these people, she tried to give the reasons behind her actions that morning. She said, "This pain that I feel every day I walk around, I'm just so miserable inside. This is a reality that's too much for me to handle. I must have peace, peace of mind, peace in my heart. Forgive me. I must go now." So Paula placed the recorder on the seat of the car and stepped outside. When the campus manager arrived about 2 hours later, he saw a woman underneath one of the ash trees. And as he approached, he realized that this woman was just too still. And then he saw the handgun. Mashia's husband had found the letters in the kitchen shortly after 6 a.m. and had gone to wake up his wife. Then she had run from the house. She and LaShawn drove across the city searching for the spot Paula might have chosen to end her life. But finally, Mashia received a call from an unknown number. A police officer told her that they had found the body of Paula Cooper. In the letter to her fiancé, Paula had written, "I have taken a life and have never felt worthy." So it sounds like she finally did have some remorse. but then had no way to really get through that.
No.
Could not push past it, which, how do you? It has to be difficult. How could you ever forgive yourself? You'd need a lot of therapy.
Sure would. For Monica, the question of what if would not leave her thoughts. What if Paula hadn't killed herself? What if she didn't have the mother that she had? What if she had a better upbringing? For those first years in prison, as a teenager, there were two Paulas. She was a girl who'd been abused for years, a child in need of help. At the same time, she was also a calculating manipulator, as competent as any sociopath. She was both. But decades later, years into her time in prison, another Paula had arrived, older, humbler, and more capable of seeing a future for herself. The problem for this Paula was that she'd become weighed down with 28 years of missed opportunities and weighed down with guilt. Growing older meant carrying the burden of what she'd done at 15 years of age. Paula had told LaShawn that she couldn't shake the feelings of guilt for her actions 30 years ago. She thought of Bill Pelke, how he had forgiven her. She thought of her many years inside, how she trained herself over that time to believe she deserved another start. But there's a big difference between forgiveness in theory and forgiveness in practice. And Paula was never able to make her way to forgiveness.
So it's very sad. Of course my heart breaks for Ruth Pelke and her family, but this makes my heart break too. In the recording that Paula made in her car that morning and in the letter she left for LaShawn, she gave detailed instructions for her funeral. She wanted potted red begonias, the flowers that LaShawn had introduced her to on a landscaping job shortly after they'd met. She wanted Patti LaBelle and Chris Brown on the stereo. And she wanted the service to be happy, quiet, and only for those who I care about. Paula asked to be laid out in a black outfit that Rhonda had recently bought for her, without any makeup. But once the memorial was over with, she wanted to be cremated. After so much time in prison, she didn't want to be placed in a box and buried in the earth.
Lew Wallace High School, where the girls in the Pelke case had been students in 1985, was demolished. Of those 4 girls, only one is still alive. That's Denise Thomas. Of her 35-year sentence, she spent 18 in prison and returned home to Gary in 2003. Unlike Paula, she had been portrayed as a minor player in the killing of Ruth Pelke, so her release happened fairly quietly. She has not spoken publicly since her appearance in court, almost 40 years ago. April had known Mrs. Pelke and sent the girls to the house on Adams Street. She was the only one whose family hired an attorney, and in a plea deal, she was sentenced to 25 years in prison. That's the shortest sentence of all. She served 14 years and moved back to Gary in 1999. April had trained in computers while in prison, had a talent for it, so she had a job waiting for her at a small architectural firm. And just a few years into her life outside, she was killed by an abusive boyfriend.
So all these girls had sad lives.
Certainly have.
Karen, who'd taken part in the stabbing of Ruth Pelke, was spared the death penalty in 1986, but she was sentenced to 60 years. After the crime, no one, including her public defenders, had spent much time exploring the events that had left the 12-year-old girl pregnant by a 17-year-old. And once she was sentenced to prison, Karen's son was placed in the Thelma Marshall's children's home. So she saw very little of him after that. I hope he's done okay, but you have to wonder that maybe he hasn't.
Right.
Right? It's generational. In the year 2000, at 31 years old, Karen began filing a series of petitions for early release without the help of counsel. Each time she would outline the prison programs in which she'd enrolled, including thousands of hours of vocational training and multiple kinds of therapy. She would mention the certificates of distinction she'd received in piano lessons and in drama class, and how she'd helped with the Christmas murals at the Ronald McDonald House and sung gospel solos in the chapel choir. She requested a reduction of sentence to 40 years and a move to the treatment center to help her with re-entry into society. But her requests were all denied. All 4 girls had eventually ended up at Rockville together after their sentences were first set. Karen and Paula had spoken every day. Karen had hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy, and around Thanksgiving of 2008, she had a defibrillator implanted in her chest. A month later, she told an officer in her dorm that she didn't feel well, and he told her, lie down, just take it easy in your bunk. Paula's room was right across from Karen's, and Paula was there when Karen died in her cell. So she had served more than 22 years of her sentence and had 5 years left until she would have been released. Paula Cooper remains one of the youngest people ever to be sentenced to death in this country. No one under the age of 18 may now be executed. A string of Supreme Court cases has also made it harder for a teenager to be sentenced to die in prison, a punishment only the United States hands down. So in the spring of 2021, the court reversed course regarding the punishment of juveniles. And in the case Jones versus Mississippi, the 6-3 conservative majority reinterpreted their recent decisions as leaving room for life without parole in cases of homicide, without the need to rule on whether that young person has a hope of rehabilitation. And in her dissent, Justice Sonia Sotomayor called this a shock and an abrupt break from precedent. So she wrote, "The court is fooling no one. In this way, the court will give license, once again, to judges who would sentence teenagers to die in prison, regardless of their potential for transformation, regardless of how they may evolve in 5, 10, 28 years. If so, little value is placed on the rehabilitation of a class of people whose character science has found still to be developing. Then the system is questioning whether anyone who has committed an act of violence has the capacity to change."
And before his death in 2020, Bill Pelke founded Journey of Hope, From Violence to Healing. This is an organization which provides public education about the needs of crime victims, and specifically the needs of family members of murder victims. Representatives from the Journey of Hope, From Violence to Healing posted word of Pelke's death on its social media page. It reads, "The Journey of Hope, From Violence to Healing is heartbroken to share the news that its founder and visionary leader, Bill Pelke, died suddenly of a massive heart attack at his home in Anchorage, Alaska, on Thursday, November 12th. We've lost one of the anchors of the movement to abolish the death penalty," said Sister Helen Pregine after this announcement. Pelke had been shoveling snow at his Alaskan home when he died.
"Revenge is never the answer," Pelke said of capital punishment. "As long as human beings decide who can live and die, we're going to make mistakes." Before he died, he planned to be at a federal prison in Terre Haute to protest the execution of Orlando Hall, who was convicted of kidnapping and killing a Texas teenager in 1994. Hall would be the 8th person executed in 2020 under the prior administration's resumption of federal executions after a nearly 20-year pause. So his organization said Pelke, who chaired the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty from 2004 to 2008, also had planned to protest executions at the prison that were planned for December 8th and December 10th. Despite concerns from family and friends about travel during the coronavirus pandemic, Pelke was present at 6 of 7 executions in Terre Haute. He also attended a protest in Washington at the U.S. Department of Justice. There haven't been any federal or state executions since Biden took office, but about 2,500 men and women do still sit on death row in federal and state prisons across the country. So in the absence of an executive order from the White House, a state still could at any moment schedule executions. So Biden's plan includes a promise to pass legislation eliminating the death penalty on the federal level and to incentivize states to follow the federal government's example. But the president only has the power to pause the federal death penalty, according to Daniel S. Medwed, a professor of law and criminal justice at Northeastern. He can't do much about the state death row cases. That's up to the governors and legislators. But he could sweep death row clean by commuting all sentences from death to life without the possibility of parole, Medwed said on CNN. So does the death penalty serve as a deterrent to violent crime? A lot of people say that it does. One recent study on the death penalty's effect on homicide rates that was published in Criminology and Public Policy found no evidence of a deterrent effect attributable to death penalty statutes. A recent issue of the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology has a study by a sociology professor and a graduate student at the University of Colorado Boulder, examining the opinions of leading criminology experts on the deterrence effects of the death penalty.
Yeah, the results reveal that most experts do not believe that the death penalty or the carrying out of executions serve as deterrents to murder, nor do they believe that existing research supports the deterrence theory. In fact, the authors report that 88% of respondents do not think that the death penalty deters murder. At the same time, only 9% of surveyed experts indicated that they believe the death penalty results in a significant drop in murder cases. 56, almost 57% completely disagreed, and 33% thought the correlation between capital punishment and lower homicide numbers to be largely inaccurate.
So all that to say we probably need to do more research.
Yeah.
But that study did build upon previous research published in 1996, in which the opinions of 67 leading experts in the field of criminology were surveyed. So the most recent study sent the same questions to a new group of experts. And the data shows that 9 of 10 states with the highest pandemic murder rates are death penalty states. So that would go against deterrence.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like a deterrence, does it?
No. But on the other hand, 8 of the 11 states with the lowest pandemic murder rates had abolished the death penalty. But if you're looking at actual executions deterring violent crime, it's difficult for studies to determine because, fortunately or not, however you think of it, very few executions are being carried out. We do know that the death penalty doesn't necessarily save any money. California has the nation's largest number of prisoners awaiting execution and incarcerates those 750 prisoners separately from other state prison inmates. So a 2012 study concluded that maintaining separate facilities meant California spent an average of $85,000 each year to incarcerate one death row prisoner, and the study concluded it cost the state an average of $45,000 each year to incarcerate a prisoner serving a life sentence without parole. Every study of death penalty cases since 1976 has found that seeking death results in substantially increased legal costs, of course.
Absolutely.
That can go on forever.
The Innocence Project believes that the death penalty should be abolished. They have represented innocent people who were wrongly convicted of murder and condemned to death in cases that were compromised by police and prosecutorial misconduct, ineffective assistance of counsel, eyewitness misidentification, unreliable forensic evidence, racial bias, and more. So according to them, the Innocence Project, capital punishment system is deeply flawed and poses a threat to innocent people.
Well, that's another thing. If you're not sure that everybody's guilty, and with DNA we found that not everyone we thought was guilty is, just the idea of putting an innocent person to death is horrific.
Yeah.
Proponents of the death penalty being legal argue that such a harsh penalty is really needed for criminals who have committed the worst crimes, and that this punishment deters crime, and that the U.S. Supreme Court has upheld the death penalty as constitutional. But opponents of the death penalty being legal argue that the punishment is cruel and unusual, and thus unconstitutional, that innocent people are put to death for crimes they didn't commit, and that the penalty is disproportionately applied to people of color. So absolutely, I mean, we could talk about the different sentencing for different people. It's the same way with men and women. Certainly men get worse punishment than women do in general. And just look at the case we've got coming up with Carla Homolka and Paul Bernardo. And she's out and about.
Living the life.
Yeah, that's more complicated, which we'll get into in a couple of weeks. But yeah, I just don't think that our system is fair. So it's hard to put people to death in a system that's not even fair. So the debate definitely continues. But then what about children being put to death? Debate continues on whether even the age of 18 is too young to assume full accountability for a crime. And some have suggested that 21 would be more appropriate. You have to be 21 to drink. So you can be put to death, but you can't have a drink.
Yeah, it's difficult trying to pick an age.
Absolutely. But new brain science shows that critical areas of the brain relating to judgment, thrill-seeking, and consequential thinking really don't mature till possibly the mid-20s. It seems kind of random to pick a number.
It is difficult.
Yeah.
It's almost, if you're dealing with a teenage murderer, it's almost like it's a case-by-case situation in terms of what are the potentials for rehabilitation.
Well, I think ideally, yes, but then you're relying on a psychological assessment. And how dependable are those? Are different people going to get different assessments depending on their upbringing, their money, their support, all that? And if it can't be fair, how can you go ahead and put people to death? That's certainly a lot to think about.
Yes, it is.
And also 27 states and the District of Columbia have banned life sentences without the possibility of parole for people under 18. And in 9 additional states, no one is serving life without parole for offenses committed before the age of 18. So if we're going to go that far with life in prison, we certainly can't be allowing people to be put to death as children.
We can't.
Well, it's a heavy topic and a sad story, but there's a lot to think about there. And I hope some of our listeners will have feedback for us on it. We can talk a little more about it.
I'm sure there'll be plenty of feedback.
So before we go to feedback, I just really quickly want to remind our TCB Premium subscribers with automatic payments made from PayPal that you need to go into our website, tiegrabber.com, to update your payment information to avoid missing out on your ad-free and bonus shows. You can still use PayPal or you can switch to a credit card. And I apologize, but in the long run, I think it'll be worth the hassle. There's a post with instructions on the website and a link in our show notes that can help you out with this. And of course, if you still aren't a member, what is it that you're waiting for? We have bonus shows and ad-free versions of our regular episodes and some really interesting cases coming up and in our archives. In March, we have 2 bonus episodes, one on Sherry Papini and that false kidnapping, and one on David Mahler, who apparently murdered his girlfriend in Hollywood in a drug-fueled rage. So if you want to become a member, you can subscribe at tiegrabber.com or on our Patreon page, which is patreon.com/tiegrabber.
It's time for listener feedback.
We got a bunch of feedback today.
Yay!
So I've got 2 voicemails, one from Barb and one from Nate. Barb suggests 1 case. Nate suggests 4 cases.
Well, that Nate, you gotta love him.
He's prolific.
He is.
I still have 2 more voicemails from Nate with more case suggestions, so we'll get around to them in the coming weeks.
Well, yeah, we can dole them out.
We can.
Excellent. All right, let's listen to Barb.
Okay.
Hi, this is Barb. I've been listening for quite a few years now. I have called in before. I just wanted to give a case suggestion. I've always been fascinated by the DC sniper case from 2002, and reading about it realized that there actually was a series of murders committed by the same set of people before they became the DC snipers. And I don't have a beer recommendation for you from there, but if you ever do a Bucks County, Pennsylvania case, I could send you beer from 6 different breweries. That's where I am, and we have just so many breweries within just a couple miles of our house.
Wow, Dick, did you hear that?
Yeah, she must live in a good place.
She must. You better find some Pennsylvania cases quick.
I'm going to try.
All right. So these DC snipers, I never heard of any of that. Have you? I mean, I vaguely remember that. Sniper attacks.
It was huge.
Was it?
Yeah.
See, my brain still wasn't functional then.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's 22 years ago.
Right.
These guys were responsible for killing 17 people and wounding 10 others. John Mohammed, he was 42 years old, and Lee Malvo was a 17-year-old. And they engaged in a series of sniper attacks. So beginning in February and continuing for 6 months in western states mostly. They killed people and wounded people. And then 3 weeks of killings in the metropolitan Washington area. And this is when it was really heating up. When they were driving around Washington, the whole city was in fear.
Yeah.
And they were very clever. In the car they used, they had made an opening in the lid of the trunk and had done some stuff to the back seat so a person could lie prone in the car with the rifle pointing out the hole in the trunk and shoot people without giving away that there was somebody in the car doing the shooting.
Well, why? Why would they want to do that?
Well, who knows?
Just for the thrill of killing people? We never found out any reasons for this?
No.
No, wow.
So the older guy, Muhammad, was given the death penalty and was executed in 2009. And Malvo was given 6 life sentences.
And that's probably because he wasn't 18. So that probably relates to what we were just talking about.
See?
Interesting.
And there's more. I mean, if you want to do it, there's a ton of info.
Absolutely. I think we should.
And we'll look into that.
Okay. And we have another voicemail from Nate.
Hi, Dick and Jill. This is Nate. your biggest fan. Anyway, I have a few case suggestions. One is the 31st anniversary of Brandon Lee's death while filming The Crow in the Carolinas is coming up at the end of March. I think maybe that could be combined with an episode on the Rust shooting, because both of them are firearms accidents that happened on set. And after The Crow, there was this large push to try to be more safe with firearms on set. But still, obviously, 20-something years later, it didn't happen. Another case that would be interesting to cover that hasn't gotten a lot of coverage is the Samuel Scheinbein case, where Samuel Scheinbein and an accomplice, Aaron Needle, killed another teenager in Maryland and then fled to Israel, or Sam fled to Israel. Aaron ended up committing suicide before trial. But the Israelis refused to extradite Samuel Scheinbein back to the United States. It's a case of some controversy. I remember growing up in Brookline, Massachusetts, which is a majority Jewish town. The case was discussed a lot. And I think another case that's never been covered that I think you guys would like is Lon Perry, the gentleman bandit of Texas. He lost his job in the late 80s, and he robbed people, business people at hotels. Very courtly kind of Cary Grant manners and everything. He passed away in 2016, but ended up pleading guilty to over 300 robberies of people at hotels. I thought it was interesting. Supposedly there's a movie script being developed about that case. I hope you guys are doing well down in the Southwest. I know it's really hot, and the weather here back in New England is unpredictable as always. Let's see, there's one other case. What other one? Could you consider also doing the case of Lorenzen Wright, which is the famous murder case of the NBA player? His ex-wife took a plea deal recently, and then she pled guilty to his murder, and I just think it would be an interesting case, and you guys are very good at covering cases, so I don't know. Those are the ones I'd suggest for now, but I hope you guys are doing well, and yeah, take care. And I have some beer suggestions too, but I'm not sure if they're related to the cases. But anyway, cheers, both of you. Take care.
Thank you, Nate. So did he have beer recommendations in the other ones that he left you?
Yes, he has lots of good recommendations for us.
All right. And I like how he threw in at the end that we're really good at covering cases. He was buttering us up a bit there, wasn't he?
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so Brandon Lee, interesting case. And actually the trial for Alec Baldwin in the Rust case is supposed to be starting soon. I think in April?
Yeah. Well, the woman who did the
armorist, I think they call her,
was found guilty.
Yes. Well, I might sound stupid, but why do you even need a real gun? Why on a movie can't you use a fake gun? And then if you need flashes of light or something, you could certainly do that on the computer in post-production.
You would think they could do CGI or something.
Absolutely.
And all that.
I think we should change that because that's ridiculous that you're actually using a real gun. And what in the hell was live ammo doing there? It's just craziness. Yeah, so that would be a fascinating thing to talk about.
That's the difficulty.
Yeah, makes no sense.
You want things to look realistic. Well, I don't think you need a real gun to be realistic.
I wouldn't think so. They can't be using real guns on TV shows and things all the time, right? I don't know, but I just think that's ridiculous. And that's going to be a fascinating case with Alec Baldwin because that guy's got an ego and there are a lot of issues on the set where they were afraid to tell him to be safe, it seems like, because he was the boss.
Yeah.
He was the producer and the star. So that's interesting. Lots of things we could talk about with that. And the next one is Samuel Scheinbein. And actually, that was recommended by someone else recently because I have some information on my computer about that.
I knew someone else had recommended it.
Yeah. And that's really a fascinating case. And you have the extradition and all that. So absolutely, I'd like to cover that one too. Nate's just filling up our calendar.
And the Gentleman Bandit is interesting. It doesn't involve any murders.
It doesn't, but it might be a nice bonus case to do 1 month.
That could be.
It's nice to take a little murder break here and there, and I like to do that for bonuses, yeah.
The other thing that Nate didn't mention was that after he'd been a couple of years or so into this, a person was arrested in suspicion of being the Gentleman Bandit.
Yeah.
And rather than have this guy stand trial or anything, Lon Perry turned himself in.
Because he's a gentleman.
Must be part of being a gentleman, right?
Wow. Okay. Well, that will be an interesting talk. Now, I always get these sports crimes mixed up in my head. So who's Lorenzen Wright and who killed him?
He was a basketball player, pretty famous in the Memphis area. Born there, raised there, went to college there, and was killed after he retired. He was active in community affairs, and he was killed. I don't know if his ex-wife did the actual killing or if she hired people to do the killing, but she was responsible for his death.
So it was a domestic type situation.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks again, Nate. And we have one email from Yvette.
We have one. She's got a couple case suggestions.
Okay, so Yvette writes, please do a show about the murder of Jacqueline Smith in Baltimore. I always wondered if she knew about her husband's criminal background and if she knew he had HIV. Also, please do the case of the dentist that was killed in Dallas, Kendra Hatcher. I love the show and tell everyone about it. Thank you. Thanks, Yvette. Telling people about it is great. Just to do a little bit of selfish things here. We would love it if people tell their friends about us and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps get out the word that we're here. And we're not just, here talking into a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
All right. So what do we know about Jacqueline Smith?
Well, I'm going to give you the abridged version.
Well, I'd expect nothing less from you.
That's true.
Or nothing more.
So Jacqueline Smith was stabbed to death in December of 2018. Her husband said that she had been killed by a panhandler.
Are we still using the word panhandler? That's like a word from Oliver Twist, isn't it?
Well, that's what he said.
Okay.
In reality, her husband did the killing, and he was helped in that by his daughter.
Oh, wow.
Jacqueline Smith's stepdaughter. Now, the daughter ended up testifying against her father.
We did a case like that before with a daughter who'd helped her father out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then Kendra Hatcher, she's a pediatric dentist, and she was killed by her boyfriend's ex-girlfriend.
Yes, I read an amazing story on this in Texas Monthly. They have a lot of great true crime stories. Of course, they're all from Texas, but fascinating read. And I think this case is a must-do because, to be honest, I thought we'd already covered it, but I can't find it on our website, so I guess we didn't. We're at the point now where I can't remember. I have to look.
Well, you are getting older.
I am getting older, and there are over 500 episodes.
Sometimes the memory, just isn't there.
Okay, thanks, doctor. I appreciate that.
But yeah, we did not do this because I thought the same thing. It sounded familiar enough.
It did, and we've done a few dentist cases. Some really good cases that were about dentists. One was a dentist who was killed by an ex-wife or something. One was a dentist who killed two women, like an old girlfriend and then a wife. A lot of interesting things. Plus, with the dentistry field, you have Wendy Adelson and the Adelson family.
Yep.
Had the big dentist practice, and they turned out to be a bunch of killers.
Alleged.
Well, no. One of them is found guilty. The rest are still alleged.
Yes.
But the son was found guilty recently.
Yeah. Wasn't he a dentist in Pennsylvania? Wife?
No, they were all in Florida.
Well, no, this is another one with a wife who was having an affair, talked to state trooper into killing her husband.
Right. It's called The Trooper's Target.
Yeah.
See, I remember the little clever names we have.
Wow.
That's why it's important to name the episodes.
I tell you, these dentists, they must be at risk.
At risk or risky, yeah. There's a lot going on with dentists. So anyway, great suggestions. Thank you, Yvette, Nate, and Barb. Thank you guys for your feedback. And everybody else, send us some feedback. We love to get it. We love to share your voicemails or emails.
That's right.
So thank you, everyone, for joining us today at the Quiet End. And we'll be coming up with some more cases soon. We've got a bonus coming out. And then, of course, another episode in 2 weeks. So until then, we'll see you at the Quiet End.
Come on down. We've got plenty of room.
We do. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.